Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Camila Oliveira. I'm glad to be here today, so I'd like to thank the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to be here. I'm going to present our baseline results of Big Pro study. It's a study that's currently under progress in partnership between Germany and Brazil. So the title of my presentation today is Eye Movements Measured by Video Oculography as Biomarkers of Preclinical Stage in Machado disease. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So as we are all aware, Machado disease is a neurodegenerative inherited disorder that has a relentless progression without any therapeutic approach like modifier for this disease. And today what we have to measure disease progression, so neurologically, are the clinical scales. These are 4 of them, 4 examples that we used today. The first 2 for measuring the ataxic manifestations, the last 2 for measuring the whole neurological examination. And in fact, the progression of these scales reflects the reality of disease, that it's of progressive but slowly progressive disorder. So the annual progression for each one of the scales is really small, and not only small, it's really variable between subjects. This gives us a really high sample size for clinical trials for a rare disease. So currently we're looking for another thing to measure disease, so a thing that we call state biomarkers. We could say that if we could find any state biomarkers that show advantages when we compare them to clinical endpoints, here would be the clinical scales, they could replace them in clinical trials and then function as surrogate endpoints. So the idea is that if we could find biomarkers that change faster than the clinical scales, or maybe with less variability, we could suggest clinical trials with smaller sample sizes or short follow-up. And furthermore, when we look for biomarkers that maybe change before the clinical onset, something that the clinical scales are not capable of detecting today, we could suggest an early intervention. So something that we could measure in these patients, and it's well described clinically, are the eye movement abnormalities. So here you can see the smooth pursuit. That's not smooth. We have saccadic intrusions between that. So it's kind of broken, the pursuit in these patients. The gaze evoked nystagmus there. Saccade dysmetria, here enters the hypermetria and hypometria, so it's not an organized eye movement. And recently, 2017, eye movement abnormalities measured by video oculography, that's this device here, were already seen since preclinical stages. So what's our aim of this part of the study is to assess the natural history of these oculomotor parameters measured with video oculography in the different stages of the disease, and maybe validate them as biomarkers of disease progression. So between August 2017 and November 2018, we recruited patients with known mutation carriers of SCA3 Machado disease and at 50% risk subjects. This one's without any symptoms that they described, and all of them went to the baseline evaluations with clinical scales. So Saranes, Kainas, as I showed you before, and the quantitative ones, CAFI and CCFS, and video oculography using ICCAM device. We evaluated for this part of the project the reflexive saccades, pursuit, and nystagmus and fixation. Afterwards, at 50% risk individuals were double-blind, were genotyped in a double-blind manner, so the examiners and the patients weren't aware of their genetic status, and divided into mutation carriers and related controls. The mutation carriers, based on the neurological examination done with SARA, were divided into ataxic carriers with a SARA score of 3 or more, or pre-ataxic carriers with a SARA score of less than 3, and the related controls, these are our groups. For the pre-ataxic carriers, we used this equation that is already published to predict the age of onset of these individuals based on the CAG repeat expansion size. And then we create this continuous timeline there that you can see. So 0 would be the ataxia onset. Here we'll have the positive values with the disease duration of the ataxic carriers, and the negative values would be here for the predicted age of onset, so time to onset of the disease. And then we divided further for the pre-ataxic carriers to see the ones that were close to disease onset, so within 4 years of disease onset, and more than 4 years. So pre-ataxic near, pre-ataxic far from onset. This is our table 1. So we had a total of 95 individuals, 36 ataxic carriers, 13 pre-ataxic carriers near onset, 24 far from onset, and 22 controls. Going for the videocalographic measurements, here is the reflexive vertical saccade velocity. You can see that it seems that there is a gradual decrease since related controls to ataxic carriers, and that there was a statistically significant difference between pre-ataxic carriers near onset and controls, so decreased velocity there. When we put this timeline, the correlation, since preclinical stages, there is a gradual decrease on the velocity of these vertical saccades. And when we look only to the pre-ataxics there, this correlation is maintained. So gradually in the pre-ataxic onset, this velocity is decreased. Here for the pursuit analysis, we didn't find any clear differences between the groups. And there, when we put in the timeline, maybe here for the horizontal pursuit gain, there is a gradual decrease there. But when we look only to the pre-ataxics, this here is maintained, but here it loses the correlation, not really clear. For this low phase velocity of gaze-evoked and central nystagmus there, mainly for the gaze-evoked nystagmus, you can see a gradual increase on this low phase velocity there, and there is a significant difference between pre-ataxic near onset and controls. Same idea there, time to onset and disease duration, a gradual increase. There is a clear correlation there with the timeline. For central nystagmus, this correlation is weaker. And only the pre-ataxic there for the gaze evoked, it's maintained, for the other one is lost. These, the correlation of for external validity with SARA, the vertical saccade velocity and this low phase velocity of gaze evoked nystagmus presented correlations with SARA score, the others didn't. So here in summary of my results, something that we could look for in the baseline analysis for a biomarker there. So if it distinguishes controls from pre-ataxic carriers, if it varies with time, and if there is external validity with SARA, we remain here for the baseline evaluations with vertical saccade velocity and slow phase velocity of gaze evoked nystagmus. So in summary, as we all know, SCA3 is a slowly progressive disorder, and it's really variable between subjects. We today have to have large sample sizes for a rare disease, and there is no current marker for preclinical stages, so surrogate endpoints are needed. As I showed you, maybe in a baseline analysis, these two parameters could be good candidate biomarkers. As Professor Gordon told us earlier, it's a low-cost portable device, it's a simple technique, and I showed you evidence showing progressive abnormalities since pre-attack stages. So it remains the question of responsiveness. So is this better than clinical scales to measure progression? We could see that in the longitudinal evaluations that are under progress. I'd like to really thank our neurogenetics research group there in Brazil, Porto Alegre, all the co-authors, my supervisor, Professor Laura Jardim. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. Our funding agencies, I thank you all for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions if you have them.
Thank you very much. Congratulations on a beautiful work and really useful one. And so the question is always, so we would like to maybe use these measures to replace other measures in terms of the clinical trials. And one thing that people always, or I think the agencies are worried about is the clinical relevance. So can you also comment on how this correlates to impact in CPAP patients, for instance?
Yeah, we in this current analysis we don't have that answer yet because we would have to have the longitudinal observations. We are doing the PGI, that's the to calculate the minimal important difference there to see if these. Of course, we're not treating the movement abnormalities. We are seeing the patients. For the patients that are symptomatic, I think we could see that because we are doing that, asking the patients if they are worse or better, and then see which is the amount of change that they would perceive. But for the pre-ataxic stage, it's kind of difficult to see that because it's not translated into clinical part. So I think for pre-ataxic stage, this concept won't be possible. But for the symptomatic stage, we plan to answer that question and compare them to the clinical scales that we have today. That's the idea.
Thank you very much for this very
Thank
nice
you.
presentation. I was wondering, in order to validate this biomarker as a surrogate biomarker, have you done any variability testing? I'm referring to intra-assessor, inter-assessors, different time points?
Yeah, we were planning to do that in our research. We were in this research. Only one evaluator was there, so it's only the intra-examiner variability. There are other studies that showed for vestibulo-ocular reflex, for saccade velocity, and these other ones that showed a good reliability between intra and inter-examiner. For pursuit, it's not really clear. So here. We could see that in our results because it really varies between controls is similar to ataxia carriers, so probably there's a high variability in the pursuit gain. But the other ones, the saccades and the slow phase velocity of nystagmus, it's validated in the literature. We didn't do in our cohort, but there is things in the literature presenting good ICCs correlations.
What would be the sample size for validations that you would estimate as being necessary?
Sample size.
To validate the biomarker in a large cohort, how large should that be?
That's tricky. I think the validation studies with the previous ones was not really large because first there was the external validity. So the gold standard for these parameters are the search qual technique. It's a really it's a lab technique. It's not really accessible, but since it's not really accessible, the sample size of these validation studies was not really big. It was 15, 20 subjects in each one of them. But I think if we have, as we have a lot of different measurements, because velocity here we have like a mean velocity of the 20 degrees, 10 degrees, a lot of different parameters. I think the sample size would not be really big, like 20 subjects would be enough to do that, to validate that. At least thinking about the previous studies that were published.
It will depend on the variability as well.
Sorry, I didn't.
It will depend on the variability.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm happy that somebody's interested in my movement. Our data of the horizontal saccades is pointing that in fact the accuracy of the saccades is really impaired in Machado because there are patients with hypometric and patients with hypermetric saccades. So we calculate the accuracy of the saccades in the horizontal plane, and we found the accuracy was really impaired in our patients. So do you have any information of accuracy in your patients?
I don't have it like the quantitative measurements. We have the gain because there is a difference there that you told us, like sometimes they have normal velocity, but it's hypermetric because they go further in the target. And then when it's slow velocity, the target, it kind of tends to be hypometric. We didn't calculate the variability here. We have the gains of the saccades. That could be a thing that we could evaluate further with a cohort, but I don't have that data here. But like seeing the patients and the results, it's really clear that the accuracy is really impaired when compared to controls.